came to Easter brunch wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, and she smiled at me the way people smile when they want something. I noticed it right away. I've been around long enough to know the difference between a warm smile and a working one. My son, I'll call him my boy because that's how I still think of him even though he's 33 years old and drives a better truck than I ever did. My boy had been dating her for about 8 months at that point. 8 months. And in those 8 months, I had met her exactly 3 times. This was the 4th. She set her purse down on my kitchen counter like she owned the place. Designer bag. One of those ones with the little gold letters on the clasp. I don't know the brand names. I'm a retired civil engineer from Columbus, Ohio. I know load-bearing structures and drainage systems. I don't know purses. My daughter-in-law to be. I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's what she wanted to be. Her name was Amber. Pretty name. Pretty woman. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But pretty and trustworthy are 2 entirely different zip codes, and I had been confusing those 2 things my whole life until my late wife set me straight about 30 years ago. God rest her soul. She always said, Hank, you look at a person's hands, not their face. Hands tell you how they work. Face tells you how they want to be seen. I thought about that a lot during that Easter brunch. Amber's hands never once touched the food she helped herself to. She picked at a piece of ham with a fork held like a scalpel. She sipped her mimosa. She talked about herself the way people talk about a city they love, with that particular kind of fondness that doesn't really make room for anyone else to contribute. She was a brand consultant. I still don't entirely understand what that means. I Googled it twice. The second Google didn't help much either. My boy sat next to her, and every time she said something, he'd nod. Not the kind of nodding where you agree, the kind where you're trying to keep the peace in a room that only you can feel is tense. I watched him the way fathers watch their sons when they think they're not being watched. And then, after she had pushed her ham around the plate for 20 minutes, Amber set her fork down, folded her hands on the table, and looked directly at me. Hank, she said, I want to talk to you about the wedding. I said, all right. She said they had been looking at venues. She said that her family had certain expectations. She said the word expectations the way some people say the word requirements, like it's already decided and you're just being informed. She mentioned a venue outside of Nashville. She mentioned a guest list of 340 people. She mentioned a catering company that apparently flew in from somewhere. She mentioned floral arrangements that needed to be ordered 8 months in advance. And then she slid a piece of paper across the table toward me. I looked down at it. It was a printed spreadsheet, itemized. I could see numbers in the right-hand column, lots of zeros. The total at the bottom said $340,000. I looked at that number for a long moment. I kept my face very still. I learned that in 31 years of dealing with city contractors who always came in over budget, you do not react until you understand the full situation. You breathe. You think. I said, She said, we think it's reasonable given the scope. I said, we. And she said, my mother and I have been planning this for quite some time. Now, here's where I should tell you something about my financial situation. I'm not a poor man. I worked for the city of Columbus for 31 years. I saved. I own my house outright. My late wife and I were careful, the way people who grew up watching their parents stretch a dollar learn to be careful. I have money set aside, but $340,000 is not a number I reach for casually. That is not nothing. That is a significant portion of what I plan to leave my son. The other thing I should tell you, I had not been consulted. Not once. Not a phone call. Not a text. Not a hey, what do you think? None of it. She had printed a spreadsheet. She had brought it to Easter brunch. She had slid it across my table between the deviled eggs and the bread rolls. And my son had not said a word. I looked up from the paper and I looked at my boy. He was staring at his plate. His jaw was set tight. He had both hands under the table. Then he looked up at me, just for a second, and he gave me a look I have not seen on his face since he was 9 years old and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball and didn't know how to tell me. He was asking for help. I folded the paper in half and I set it beside my plate. I said, Amber, would you mind getting me a glass of water from the kitchen? I think I forgot to put out the pitcher. She blinked. She said, "Of course," and she got up. The moment she was through that doorway, my boy leaned across the table, and he said quietly, quickly, like a man who has been waiting to say something for a very long time, he said, "Dad, this is not what I wanted. She planned all of this without me. She planned all of this without me. She's been taking money from me for months. I didn't know how bad it was until last week. I didn't know how to tell you." I said, "How much?" He said, "About $50,000. I said, "Over how long?" He said, 14 months. I heard the refrigerator open in the kitchen, the sound of the pitcher being lifted off the shelf. I put my hand on my boy's arm. I said, "Don't say another word right now. I've got this." He looked at me. He looked like he might cry, which is something I have not seen from him in 15 years. He nodded once. Amber came back with the water pitcher. She refilled my glass. She sat back down and smoothed her silk blouse and smiled at me like we'd just been discussing the weather. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down, and I said, "Tell me more about your mother's expectations." Over the next 3 hours, 3 hours sitting at that Easter table while the ham got cold, my son told me everything. Not at the table. Amber eventually excused herself to make a phone call, something about a client, and during that time my boy walked me through 14 months of what I can only describe as a very sophisticated and very personal financial operation. It had started small, car trouble, 6 months into the relationship. The transmission on her Honda had gone out, she said, and she didn't have the cash right now. Could he help her out? She'd pay him back. $3,000. She didn't pay it back. Then there was the medical bill. Something about a procedure. She'd been uninsured between jobs. She was so embarrassed to ask. Another $2,800. He gave it to her. She cried. He felt good about helping. Then there was the investment. A friend of hers was opening a wellness studio. Yoga, infrared saunas, that kind of thing. Real growth industry, Amber said. Her friend needed seed money to make the deposit on the space. Amber was going to invest herself, but she was a little short. Could my son contribute? She could get him in for $15,000. He'd see triple returns in 18 months. The wellness studio never opened. Then her landlord had raised her rent unexpectedly, and she needed first and last on a new place. Another $9,000. Then the laptop she needed for work died, and she needed a professional grade replacement. $1,400. Small things, mid-sized things, one medium large thing. Always a reason, always a story, always emotion, tears sometimes, stress always, gratitude that felt enormous in the moment and somehow evaporated by the following week. My son is not a stupid man. He has a degree in software development. He works for a good company. He pays his bills on time. He is careful and precise in his professional life. But he is also, like his father, someone who feels deeply, who wants to believe in people, who was raised by a woman who said you help people when they need it and you trust that it comes back around. Amber had read him correctly from the very beginning. She knew which lever to pull. What he had not known until last week was that he wasn't the only one. He'd run into a friend of hers at a gas station, a man who turned out to be her ex-boyfriend of 2 years, and in the course of a brief and awkward conversation, certain details emerged. Amber had borrowed $11,000 from this man. She had told him the same story about the wellness studio. My boy came home and he sat with that for 6 days. 6 days trying to decide what to do, whether he was wrong, whether there was an explanation, watching her sleep, watching her make coffee in his kitchen, watching her call her mother on the phone and laugh. And then she brought the spreadsheet to Easter brunch. And that was when he knew he needed his father. I listened to all of this without interrupting. I asked clarifying questions. I kept my voice even. Inside I felt about 15 different things, but I kept them all behind my face, which was something I had 31 years of practice at. When he was finished, I said, "Did she put anything in writing? Any of those requests?" He pulled out his phone. He handed it to me. Months of text messages. "Hey babe, can you Venmo me for that? I'll explain later. You're literally saving my life. I'll get you back by Friday, I promise. My mom is so stressed about my finances, I can't tell her. You're the only person who really takes care of me." I scrolled slowly. I read carefully. I took note of dates and amounts. I handed the phone back. I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay, what?" I said, "Okay, I know what I need to do. Go back inside. Be normal. Let me handle the rest of this." He looked at me for a long moment. He's 33 years old. He's taller than me. He's been living on his own for 11 years. But in that moment, he looked like the little boy who broke the neighbor's window, and he nodded, and he went back inside. I sat on the porch by myself for about 5 minutes. I am not a man who acts out of anger. I used to be when I was younger. I had a temper I inherited from my father that I spent 20 years learning to manage. My wife helped. Time helped. What I learned eventually was that anger is fast and justice is slow, and if you want actual results, you slow yourself down and you think before you move. So I thought. The first call I made was to a lawyer. I have a friend, a retired attorney who now mostly does estate work, but who has seen enough in his career to know his way around a civil fraud situation. I explained the basics. He said the text messages were significant. He said depending on how everything was documented, there were real options. He said don't do anything rash. I told him that was never my plan. The second call I made was to my son's bank. He had authorized me years ago on one of his accounts, a holdover from when he was in college, and I was helping him manage some medical expenses. That authorization had never been removed. I couldn't do anything unilateral, and I wasn't trying to, but I wanted to understand the full scope of what had moved in and out. The third call I made, and this one I thought about carefully before I dialed, was to Amber's mother. I had her number because she had called me once, months ago, to introduce herself. Pleasant woman on the phone. Talked about how happy she was that Amber had found someone stable. I had thought at the time that was an odd word to use. Stable, like it was a specific quality she had been searching for. I called her. I introduced myself again. I said I wanted to have a straightforward conversation about some financial concerns I'd developed. There was a pause. Then she said carefully, "What kind of concerns?" I said I had documentation of $47,000 transferred from my son's accounts to her daughter over 14 months, and that I was planning to share that documentation with an attorney who specialized in civil fraud cases, and that I wanted to give her family the opportunity to address this before any formal process began. There was a very long silence. Then she said, "I'm going to need to call you back." She did not call back. What happened instead, over the next 2 weeks, was a series of increasingly panicked communications from Amber, first affectionate, then explanatory, then accusatory, then apologetic, then threatening, then silent. My son, on the advice of the attorney, responded to none of them and saved every single one. The engagement was over within 10 days of Easter brunch. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming. My son changed the locks on his apartment. He had his bank cards reissued. He updated his Venmo settings. Amber, through her mother, offered to repay $20,000. Her attorney, yes, she had an attorney, framed it as a goodwill gesture and not an admission of any wrongdoing. My son's attorney said that was a starting point, not a settlement. There was more back and forth. Eventually, an agreement was reached for full repayment in structured installments. It is documented. It is legally binding. She will be paying my son back until 2027. I never raised my voice. I never sent a single angry text. I sat across from her at Easter brunch and kept my face perfectly still and said, while I read a spreadsheet requesting $340,000 of my money for a wedding that never would have happened anyway. My boy asked me later, after it was all resolved, how I had stayed so calm. He said he was watching my face across the table when she slid that paper over, and he couldn't understand how I didn't react. I told him what his mother told me 30 years ago. You look at the hands, not the face. Amber's hands, that Easter morning, never once touched the food on her own plate, but they had been in my son's wallet for over a year. I saw it. I just needed time to be sure. That's what fathers are for. I still think about the moment my son pressed that phone into my hand under the table. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. Not on the outside. We were just two men sitting at an Easter table with cold ham and a woman smiling too perfectly across from us. But in that small, quiet gesture, I understood something that took me 60-something years to fully believe. The people who love us don't always know how to ask for help out loud. Sometimes they just reach across and hand you something and hope you're paying attention. I was paying attention. What Amber did wasn't just dishonest, it was calculated. She studied my son the way a person studies a lock before they pick it. She found the right combination, which was his decency, his willingness to believe the best in people, the values his mother and I spent 30 years trying to build in him. And she used those exact qualities against him. That's the particular cruelty of what she did. She didn't exploit his weakness, she exploited his character. But here's what I've come to understand, sitting with this long after the legal agreements were signed, and the installment payments started coming in. What happened to my son was not a failure of intelligence. He is a sharp, careful man. It was a test of something harder to develop than intelligence, and that's the discipline to slow down when everything in you wants to trust, to look again when the story sounds right, but something underneath it doesn't sit quite level. That kind of discernment doesn't come from books. It comes from being burned, or from watching someone you love get burned, and deciding that next time you'll catch it sooner. My son caught it. He was 6 days late maybe, but he caught it, and when he did, he didn't panic. He didn't confront her in anger. He waited for the right moment, and he reached for his father. That took more self-control than most people his age have, and I am not going to pretend I wasn't proud of him for it. For my part, I had to fight every instinct I had that Easter afternoon. I wanted to slide that spreadsheet back across the table and tell her exactly what I thought of her and her silk blouse and her mother's expectations. But I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, over decades, that the cost of acting on that kind of anger is that you hand the other person the advantage. You become the problem. You give them a story to tell. So I breathed. I kept my face still. I asked her for a glass of water just to get 60 seconds alone with my son. 60 seconds was enough. The outcome wasn't perfect. $50,000 was taken from my boy, and even with a repayment agreement, he will carry something from this that has nothing to do with money. Trust, once it's been used against you, doesn't fully rebuild in the same shape. That's just true, but I also know that he is going to move through the rest of his life with a sharper eye, a steadier gut, and the knowledge that when he really needed somebody, his father showed up without raising his voice. That's the thing about doing right by the people you love. It doesn't always look like a rescue. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting very still at an Easter table, folding a spreadsheet in half and saying, my wife would have handled it better and faster, I'm sure. She always did. But I did the best I could with what she taught me, and it was enough.